Brian May has finally spoken about Rory Gallagher, and what he revealed has left the fans shocked.
Go and see Rory every week and just open-mouthed, I think, at the way the guy played and the person he was and the way he interacted with his audience, the way he could just hold people by tapping his foot or clicking his fingers or whatever he did. You know, he was just a magician as far as we were concerned as an entertainer. And funnily enough, he probably wouldn't think of himself as an entertainer. He's such a pure man, Rory, you know. He thought of himself as a musician, and he never made any compromises towards building himself into a superstar. But we went there every week and saw Taste, and they were magnificent. It was incredible.
Brian May became one of the most recognised guitarists on the planet, but for decades he has pointed to one man as the reason his guitar sounds the way it does. A quiet, humble Irishman named Rory Gallagher. Their story involves a battered amplifier, a tiny electronic box, and a kindness that a teenage Brian May never forgot. Stay tuned, because we're about to uncover what Brian May said about Rory Gallagher. Two boys who fell in love with the guitar. Long before either of them stepped near a stadium stage, Brian May and Rory Gallagher were just two kids from ordinary homes who happened to fall completely in love with the same instrument. Brian Harold May was born on July 19, 1947, in Hampton, Middlesex, England, to parents Ruth and Harold May. He was, by his own description, a shy and uncertain teenager who didn't quite know who he was or where he fit in. What he did know was that he loved music and he loved science in equal measure, and somehow those two obsessions would end up defining the rest of his life. Around 1963, 16-year-old Brian and his father Harold took on an extraordinary project together, building an electric guitar completely from scratch. They didn't have money for a proper instrument, so they made do with whatever they could find. The neck came from a piece of an old 18th century fireplace mantel a family friend was about to throw away. The tremolo arm was built from a bicycle saddlebag holder and part of a knitting needle. Even the guitar's pickups and springs were homemade or repurposed. It took father and son more than a year to finish it, and the result became known as the Red Special, the very same instrument Brian May would go on to play on every single Queen record and every major concert for the rest of his career. While Brian was tinkering away with his homemade guitar in England, over in Ireland, a different kind of guitar story was unfolding. William Rory Gallagher was born on March 2nd, 1948, in Ballyshannon, County Donegal, though he was raised in Cork, where his family settled while his father worked various jobs after leaving the Irish Army. Rory picked up his first guitar at the age of 9, and by his early teens, he was already saving up for something better. In 1963, at just 15 years old, he bought a battered second-hand 1961 Fender Stratocaster on credit from a music shop in Cork for £100. That same Stratocaster, its factory paint eventually stripped away by decades of sweat and hard playing, would become one of the most recognisable guitars in rock history, permanently fused to Rory's identity, the same way the Red Special became fused to Brian's. Rory's path into music moved fast. He left school at 15 and joined a touring show band called The Impact, playing ballrooms all across Ireland. By 1966, he had formed his own group, a blues-based power trio that would eventually just be called Taste. The band built a following first in Ireland, then in Hamburg, and eventually crossed over to Britain, where they landed a residency at one of London's most important music venues of the era, the Marquee Club on Wardour Street. It was at the Marquee that Taste supported Cream at their farewell concert, and where Rory earned a reputation among London's musicians as a genuine phenomenon, a guitarist so respected that Eric Clapton once offered to let him use his own Marshall amplifier stack. Rory turned it down because it simply didn't give him the tone he was after. Even at that early stage, before Taste had really broken through, Rory already knew exactly what he wanted his guitar to sound like, and he wasn't going to compromise for anybody, not even Clapton. Meanwhile, Brian May was still a student, studying physics and later astronomy at Imperial College London, playing music on the side in a band called Smile with his friend Roger Taylor. Brian and his mates were regulars at the London club scene of the late 60s, chasing whatever great live act was passing through town on a given night. This was a golden era for guitar music in London, with legends like Jimi Hendrix blowing minds at nearly every gig, and a young, still uncertain Brian May soaking up everything he could from the players who came through. It was in this environment, at the Marquee Club specifically, that Brian and his friends discovered Taste and discovered Rory Gallagher. What's remarkable is how different these two young men's personalities already were, even though they were pulled toward the exact same instrument. Rory was intensely private and single-minded, uninterested in fame for its own sake, obsessed purely with the craft of playing. Brian was more of a dreamer and a tinkerer, someone who built his own tools by hand and who split his attention between the guitar and the stars. But there was a real symmetry underneath those differences. Both boys grew up without much money. Both were self-taught in the deepest sense, learning by ear and by instinct rather than formal training. And both of them, independently, were about to discover that the secret to a truly great guitar tone wasn't really about talent alone. It was about gear, instinct, and a willingness to fight for the exact sound living inside your head. Rory had already found his. Brian was still searching, and he was about to find it in the most unexpected way, by hiding in a bathroom after closing time. The night at the Marquee that changed everything. Every legendary friendship seems to have one small, unforgettable moment behind it. And for Brian May and Rory Gallagher, that moment happened on a Thursday night at the Marquee Club sometime in the late 1960s. By this point, Taste had a standing residency there, and Brian and his friends made a habit of showing up nearly every week just to watch Rory play. Brian has said many times over the years that watching Rory on that stage left him and his mates completely open-mouthed, stunned not just by the guitar playing itself, but by the way Rory connected with the crowd. He could hold an entire room's attention just by tapping his foot or snapping his fingers, without any theatrics, without any of the showmanship that other performers of the era leaned on. Brian has described Rory as elemental, a performer with absolutely no pretense, someone whose audience felt like they were having a one-on-one conversation with him, even in a room full of people. One night, Brian and his friends decided they weren't ready to leave when the show ended. According to Brian's own retelling, they hid inside the venue, tucked away out of sight until the room had emptied out and the staff had finished closing up. Then they came out and approached Rory directly, while he was busy packing up his own equipment. That detail matters more than it might seem. Rory was already one of the most respected guitarists in London at the time, yet here he was, packing his own amp and his own guitar into the van himself, with no entourage doing it for him. When these star-struck teenagers nervously asked him how he got that sound out of his guitar, Rory didn't brush them off. He didn't tell them to get lost or complain that he was tired after a long gig. He simply started explaining, patiently and generously, exactly how his rig worked. Rory told them it was actually fairly simple. He had a Vox AC30 amplifier, which he said sounded completely different from any other amp out there, warm and full in a way nothing else quite matched. Then there was his guitar itself, which by that point was practically an extension of his own hands. And finally, there was one more small piece of the puzzle, a tiny electronic device that sat between the guitar and the amplifier, a treble booster made by a company called Dallas, known as the Rangemaster. That little box pushed extra signal into the amp, driving it just hard enough to make it genuinely sing, rather than simply play loud. Brian didn't waste any time. The very next day, he went down to a shop on Wardour Street, not far from the Marquee itself, and found 2 second-hand Vox AC30 amplifiers for around £30 each, a significant amount of money for a student at the time. He tracked down a Rangemaster treble booster of his own, plugged it into the homemade Red Special he'd built with his father, turned everything up, and instantly knew he had found what he'd been chasing. Brian has described the moment almost as a physical sensation, saying the sound hit him somewhere deep in his stomach the second he turned it on. That exact combination, the Red Special, a Vox AC30, and a Rangemaster treble booster, became the foundation of Brian May's guitar tone for the rest of his career. It's there on Queen's very first album, and it's still there on Queen's final studio record decades later. Nearly every guitar sound Brian May has ever made on a record traces back, in some direct way, to a few generous minutes Rory Gallagher spent with a group of teenage strangers outside a London club. It's worth pausing on just how significant that kindness really was. Rory could easily have brushed these kids off. He'd just finished a demanding gig. He was tired, and he owed these strangers nothing at all. Instead, according to Brian, Rory treated them exactly the way he treated everyone, with patience, warmth, and genuine respect. That single choice, made in a matter of minutes on an ordinary night, ended up shaping the sound of one of the biggest rock bands in history. The sound and the craft. What Brian really learned. The story of the amp and the treble booster is the most famous part of this relationship. But it's really just the surface of what Brian May absorbed from Rory Gallagher. The deeper lesson was about technique, and about how a guitarist actually communicates through his instrument. Brian has explained that a great deal of what he took from watching Rory play was rooted in a specific playing technique, quickly turning notes on and off, snapping them in and out with sharp, percussive control. Brian found that technique endlessly fascinating because it made the guitar feel far more flexible and expressive than simply holding notes out. He has directly credited certain Rory Gallagher songs, including tracks like Morning Sun and What's Going On, as the exact source of some of his own riff-writing style, and he has said outright that a song as central to Queen's catalogue as Tie Your Mother Down carries a direct musical lineage back to what he learned from studying Rory's playing. That's a remarkable thing for one of the most celebrated guitarists in rock history to admit. Brian May isn't simply saying he admired Rory Gallagher from a distance. He's saying that specific mechanics of his own guitar playing, techniques audiences have heard on some of Queen's most famous songs, were learned directly by watching Rory night after night at the marquee. There's also the matter of Rory's relationship with his audience, something Brian has returned to again and again when asked about him. Brian has pointed out that Rory never really thought of himself as an entertainer in the traditional sense. He thought of himself purely as a musician, and he never made any compromises in the direction of building himself into a manufactured superstar. Brian has contrasted this directly with his own approach in Queen, admitting that he and his bandmates were consciously theatrical, putting on a show in the fullest sense of the word, complete with staging and spectacle. Rory's approach was almost the opposite. He would walk out, play his songs, talk to the crowd a little, ask for a couple of stage lights, and let the music itself carry the entire performance. Brian has said that kind of purity is part of what makes Rory someone to genuinely respect, precisely because he never chased the trappings of stardom that so many of his contemporaries pursued. That contrast becomes even more interesting when you consider how Brian sees the cost of Rory's choices. Brian has openly said that he doesn't believe Rory ever received the level of recognition he deserved, and that this was in some sense a direct result of Rory sidestepping the very things that could have turned him into a stadium-level star, along the lines of a Bruce Springsteen or an Aerosmith. Rory seemed to genuinely prefer the intimacy of smaller club environments, where he could feel a direct connection with the people in front of him. Brian has guessed, by his own admission speculating rather than stating it as fact, that Rory might not have enjoyed the distance and spectacle of arena and stadium shows nearly as much, because it would have stripped away exactly the kind of closeness with an audience that made his performances so powerful in the first place. What comes through again and again in the way Brian talks about Rory isn't just admiration for his technique. It's admiration for his character, for a kind of stubborn, quiet integrity that refused to bend toward commercial pressure. Brian has described Rory as a gentleman in every sense of the word. someone who had genuine time and patience for people, whether that person was a paying fan, a fellow professional musician, or a group of nervous teenagers hanging around after a gig hoping for 30 seconds of his attention. For Brian, that generosity of spirit is inseparable from the guitar playing itself. You can't really understand Rory Gallagher's sound, in Brian's telling, without understanding the sincerity of the man producing it. A friendship that never faded. What makes the story of Brian May and Rory Gallagher so unusual is that it didn't stay frozen in that one night at the Marquee Club. Over the following decades, their paths kept crossing, and every single time, according to Brian, Rory treated him exactly the same way. Brian has recalled bumping into Rory many times over the years as both of their careers grew. Brian eventually becoming a member of one of the biggest rock bands on the planet, and Rory continuing to build his own reputation as a relentless touring blues rock guitarist with millions of records sold worldwide. Brian has said that no matter how many years passed, or how much success either of them had achieved, Rory greeted him with the same warmth every time, asking how he was doing in the same easygoing, friendly manner, as if nothing about their relative fame had changed anything between them. Brian has pointed to one particular encounter, running into Rory at a studio in the Shepherd's Bush area of London, where Rory greeted him with that exact same gentle, familiar tone he'd used back when Brian was just a teenager hanging around outside the Marquee. That consistency struck Brian deeply. He has said it made him realise Rory hadn't just been polite to him because they'd become acquainted over the years. Rory had genuinely treated him with the same respect back when Brian was a complete unknown, and Rory was already something of a star. Brian has also spoken about actually seeking Rory out specifically to tell him how much his influence had meant, making a deliberate point, whenever their paths crossed, of letting Rory know just how much he had given him. According to Brian, Rory tended to respond to this kind of praise with humility, brushing it off in his usual self-effacing way, rather than dwelling on the compliment. But Brian has said he's genuinely glad he took those opportunities when he had them. Glad he found the words to properly thank the man who had shaped his entire musical identity, especially given how Rory's life would eventually end. There's also a broader context worth understanding here, because Brian wasn't the only major guitarist who felt this way about Rory Gallagher. Over the decades, Rory has been named as a direct influence by an extraordinary range of musicians, including Johnny Marr of the Smiths, Slash of Guns N' Roses, The Edge of U2, Joe Bonamassa, and Gary Moore, among many others. Bonamassa in particular has gone on to hold tribute concerts in Rory's honour in Cork, and even acquired one of Rory's own treble booster units directly from the Gallagher family, describing the moment as one of the great honours of his career. That kind of reach, shaping the sound and outlook of so many different guitarists across genres and generations, says something about just how singular Rory's musicianship really was. Brian May's story isn't an isolated case of one grateful fan. It's one prominent example of an influence that rippled out across the entire landscape of modern guitar playing. What ties all of this together is something Brian has circled back to repeatedly in interviews: the idea that Rory Gallagher was more than just a guitar hero to him. Rory was, in Brian's own words, present in his life always, someone he finds himself talking about even more as the years go by. That's a striking thing to hear from a man who co-founded Queen, who has sold hundreds of millions of records, who holds a doctorate in astrophysics, and who has collaborated with NASA. With all of that behind him, Brian May still returns, again and again, to a quiet blues guitarist from Cork, who once took a few minutes out of a long night to be kind to a stranger. The loss, and what Rory left behind. Rory Gallagher's story, unlike Brian May's, did not get the chance to stretch across many more decades. Years of relentless, nearly non-stop touring, combined with a fear of flying that led to heavy sedative use and years of alcohol consumption, gradually took a serious toll on his body. By the early 1990s, his health was quietly declining, though he kept it largely private and continued performing for as long as he possibly could. His final live performance took place on January 10th, 1995, in Rotterdam, and by that point, he was visibly unwell, forcing the remainder of the tour to be cancelled. Admitted to King's College Hospital in London that March, doctors discovered his liver was failing, and in a desperate attempt to save his life, Rory underwent a liver transplant. For a while, it seemed like it might work. Then, he developed a serious staphylococcal infection, and on June 14th, 1995, Rory Gallagher died at the age of 47. The news shocked the music world, in large part because Rory had kept his declining health so private that many people had no idea just how sick he really was. His body was flown home to Cork, where thousands of people lined the streets as his funeral cortege passed through the city he grew up in. Fellow musicians attended in large numbers, including members of U2 and the Dubliners, alongside guitarist Gary Moore and former bandmates who performed at the service itself. In the years since, Ireland has honoured him repeatedly, with statues raised in his birthplace of Ballyshannon and in Belfast, streets and public spaces renamed after him in Cork, Dublin, and even Paris, and an annual international tribute festival that continues to draw thousands of fans to Ballyshannon every year. For Brian May, this wasn't simply the loss of a musical hero. It was the loss of the man who, quite literally, gave him his sound, his technique, and a personal example of humility that Brian has said he carried with him throughout his own career. When Brian speaks about Rory today, there's a noticeable tenderness in how he does it, an unmistakable sense of gratitude mixed with real sadness, that a man so generous and so talented was taken from the world far too early. Brian has openly called it awful, has said Rory deserved so much more recognition than he ever received, and has made clear that not being able to give proper thanks in person anymore is something he still feels the weight of. Perhaps the most fitting way to understand this relationship is to look past the fame on either side of it entirely. This wasn't a story about two rock stars networking with each other for mutual benefit. It was about a decent, generous man who happened to be an extraordinary guitarist, taking a few minutes out of an exhausting night to answer a stranger's question honestly and kindly, and about that stranger never forgetting it. Every time Brian May plugs his Red Special into a Vox AC30 with a treble booster in between, whether on a Queen record or in front of a packed stadium decades later, some part of that sound traces directly back to Rory Gallagher, packing up his own gear outside a London club, taking the time to explain his secret to a group of boys who had no business still being there. Rory Gallagher never chased the spotlight the way some of his contemporaries did, but through Brian May's guitar, and through the countless other musicians who carry pieces of his influence forward, some part of Rory Gallagher is still, in a very real sense, being heard every single day. So thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.